Welcome to American Issues Take One on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about the weaponization of intolerance in the US. How is it affecting our American democracy? Our guest for the show is Colin Moore, Dr. Colin Moore, Director of the UH Public Policy Center. Welcome to the show, Colin.
Happy to be here, Jay.
You know, the racist orders and actions coming out of Washington these days are having increasingly toxic effects on American principles and American life. We need to study these effects and consider whether they are appropriate to our form of government, our society, and what, if anything, can be done to return to arguably the tolerance we had before. Colin Moore, professor of political science at UH Manoa, helps us understand how racism, intolerance, isolationism, nationalism are being weaponized at federal and state levels. So, Colin, is it fair to say that we've always had intolerance in this country?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can look at the nativism and xenophobia that goes back to the 18th century. Of course, this is a country founded on slavery, so there's a long history of racial segregation, from slavery through Jim Crow to the Red Scares in the mid 20th century. And so, there's a long tradition, of course, of liberalism, of human rights, and also a long and dark tradition of racism and nativism. And over time, if you study the full length of American history, you can see times when those really become more intense, periods where culture becomes far more racist, and at times it seems to recede a bit, and we political discourse seems to emphasize liberal principles, and then it comes back. I mean, this really is in America's DNA. And so it's not new, but I think that there was an assumption that we were moving beyond this, that the U.S. was increasingly becoming a more tolerant place, and I think that you have seen the backlash. So it's not new in U.S. history. This has happened many times, but it is, I think, surprising and particularly intense right now.
This is all kind of in our lifetimes, isn't it? I mean, I remember the 60s, the 70s. We became more tolerant, didn't we? I mean, life in these United States was a move to liberal tolerance. And of course, that's changed since then. But do you agree that there was a time in the not too distant past when this country was moving to tolerance?
Absolutely. I mean, and so I think you mentioned the 60s, and of course, this is the era of the civil rights movement. I think that many people thought when President Obama was elected, that this was kind of a particularly important moment, of course, because we had the first African American president, and then that this would mean America had finally moved beyond its racist roots. But of course, it has returned, in force. So, I mean, even during the Biden administration, I mean, there has been tremendous expansions, I think, in tolerance. And so, although we are seeing a backlash, I mean, I think it's important to remember what this country looked like in the 20 years ago, 50 years ago. I mean, for the LGBT population, of course, you've seen huge gains in tolerance. That has been pushed back a bit, particularly for trans folks. But it is. I think it's fair to say that this is a far more tolerant place than it was even 20 years ago, despite some of the actions of the Trump administration.
Well, you talk about this place. Hawaii has been very tolerant. Hawaii has had the benefit, if you want to call it a benefit, of the plantations, where everybody had to work together, and everybody was, on the same sort of democratized level, whatever that was. And they got to know each other's cultures. They married, they had children together, and all. So Hawaii has a special advantage. But I'm thinking that other areas in the countries have a special disadvantage. So would you say, for example, that some parts of the country are more intolerant than others?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, you can measure that. I think, curiously, though, you tend to find places that are the most intolerant are often the places that are the least diverse. So if you are trying to measure people's tolerance to immigrants. The places where folks are often the least tolerant are places where they don't have very many immigrants. I mean, places like the parts of the American South, West Virginia. So that's always the irony, is that exposure, of course, leads to a lot more, much more tolerance. And many places that are the most deeply fearful of, for example, immigrants, are places where there aren't very many immigrants.
I remember in the election of 2016, there was a story in the Times about a Vietnamese woman who was in a Midwest school, and she was trying to cross a line that was line of people that was lined up to see Donald Trump, and they wouldn't let her through, and they made racist comments on her. And she had a roommate who was Howley, and she got back to her room with her roommate, and she reported this happened, and the roommate reported it to the New York Times. And I thought it was very interesting because I hadn't seen that before. And there was a clear connection between those who lined up to see Donald Trump make his remarks, okay, and those who were catcalling her. And I began to realize that somehow they associated Donald Trump with racism against this Vietnamese woman. So the question I put to you is Donald Trump a racist?
Rather than answering that yes or no, I mean, I think that there is many of his actions would lead me to believe that he is, or certainly has taken embraced racially ascriptive policy. But I think that the thing about Trump, and the thing about the rhetoric that has come from the White House recently, is that people perceive this as the president saying that it is essentially okay to be a racist. I mean, I think that's the difference. I think there was a very important moment years ago when John McCain was running against Barack Obama, and someone in this town hall McCain was part of. One of the people in the audience, started to bring up these conspiracy theories about President Obama, saying he wasn't born in Hawaii, and the usual junk. And John McCain looked at her. This was a reporter, someone at one of his events, and said, I'm sorry, ma'am, that's not correct. He's a good family man. We just happen to disagree on politics. You used to see more of that pushback from major party candidates, that they would not look the other way. I mean, and we're talking about the 90s on. Of course, if you go back earlier, you have plenty of politicians who were using running race baiting campaigns all the time. But recently, that's been very unusual. I mean, when supporters or people who were associated with the candidate start making racist remarks, the candidates are usually very quick to distance themselves. And that has never been something President Trump has done. I mean, you can imagine the now infamous torch light event that happened at the University of Virginia, where he, I think, infamously said, they're at the, I don't remember the quote off the top of my head.
It was like, there's some good people on both sides.
Both sides, good people on both sides. That's right. And that really shocked a lot of people in his cabinet. And I think it's only become more extreme, that this kind of casual racism that you see coming from officials in the White House. I mean, the kind of shocking memes they will sometimes post on official White House accounts about immigrants. This is unprecedented, and I think that to me is one of the most certainly concerning aspects about the administration is that I think they have given people license to be racist. I mean, and to go back to what has always been this, underlying the surface in this country, that the only real Americans are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were born here, and everyone else is just visiting. And I think that is the attitude, that the sense people get from the White House, rationally, because they're more or less saying that. And I think they're interpreting this as license to be racist. So things people might not have said before, I mean, actions they might not have taken. I think they feel empowered to be racists. Whether Donald Trump is himself personally, I'm not sure, but he certainly has feels comfortable surrounding himself and drawing support from people who are certainly racists.
Let me just go back to the Central Park Five, if you remember them, five young black kids, and they didn't have a case against them, but Trump took out a full-page ad in one of the New York newspapers to say they should be convicted and severely punished. I forget whether the punishment was life imprisonment or execution. But that seemed to me to be an early indication of where he stood. And remember, he comes from New York. He was involved as a slum landlord. A lot of his tenants were black and Puerto Rican, I suppose. And in fact, he was involved in litigation by the then Department of Justice. I have to make that distinction: the then Department of Justice, that he was violating civil rights laws. He and his father both. And I can't get that out of my mind, Colin, but there it is. His background sort of indicates where his true direction is. But let me ask you, how does this kind of phenomenon where he sends these messages to those who would be racist, and they include his base for sure, and the Proud Boys and all that crowd, and they act on it. And this is very scary because sometimes they act in a way that is violence. And I guess I'm asking is, how does this kind of phenomenon, this process, this sending of the messages, affect our political system?
It's deeply damaging. I mean, there's no there's no other way to put it. I mean, because it gives people, like I was saying, permission to not just be racist. I mean, you have the erosion of democratic norms that, this sort of rhetoric normalizes intolerance. It deepens the polarization we already have. I mean, it emphasizes these identity-based cleavages. And so we're continually moving away from what I would call healthy democratic differences based on issues, to the kind of zero-sum conflicts over race and culture and belonging. That's dangerous for any democracy. And then you get, as this becomes more extreme, of course, you get threats to public safety. I mean, threats of political violence. Of course, we've already seen that related to Donald Trump when he lost his reelection bid the first time, and it delegitimizes institutions. I mean, this is a pluralist nation. And when leaders are implying that immigrants or other people are enemies of the state, it invites violence, and it's very difficult for democracy to survive under these conditions, because you are making people more fearful. You are dividing the country into allies and enemies. And you're normalizing racism, and I think you're giving people license to move to extremism and potentially even violence.
Yeah, when they talk about a divided country, the divisiveness in the country, which existed in his first term, but certainly exists more now, they're really talking about intolerance. They're really talking about racism. They're really talking about black and white, immigrant versus non-immigrant, and so forth. I would like to ask you about some things that have emerged that may or may not be examples of this racist communication. One thing is DEI, the attack on DEI.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that DEI is something very specific, but it has become emblematic of these broader cultural and political divides, right? I mean, originally, the idea behind DEI is just to promote fair representation of people who've been historically marginalized. But this has become a catchphrase and a way to talk about racism without using an older, more familiar racist rhetoric. And so if it's the manifestation of woke culture, if it's, this term is a term that allows you to say things that I would argue are racist, without using words that everyone would agree are certainly racist. So there's a bit of I mean, people used to talk about the dog whistle, right? I mean, that you would be signaling racist ideas without using racist language. And this is an old tradition in American politics. I mean, particularly after the civil rights movement, of course, before many politicians just would simply say racist things. When that became unacceptable, there were ways to talk about, kind of activate people's racial resentments without using racist language. Some people have said, there's a famous argument that George H.W. Bush did this when he was running for president, by talking about and displaying pictures of African Americans in prison and talking about being tough on crime, but really signaling that they were going to be tough on crime for a particular group of people. That used to be, when we talk about racism at the federal level in politics, it was usually through these more subtle dog whistle, kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, rhetorical turns of phrase. Donald Trump has taken that much further. I mean, it's, he doesn't use the language of, Dixiecrat language. But these new terms, woke, DEI, the critique is rarely what those programs are trying to do. It becomes a kind of catch-all for what many of his supporters feel like are, programs that have helped people of color, and they're not supportive of that. It's not a critique of the very specific programs, which, I think some people can argue, and fairly so sometimes, that maybe they've gone too far in the very specific implementations. But under Trump and the way I think he uses ideas like DEI and woke, I think it becomes a stand-in for a much more familiar and much darker racist rhetoric.
So you said catchphrase, and it reminds me of the word catching. Would you agree with me that when you proselytize somebody into accepting DEI as a racist term, as to reaching down to this base notion of finding racism in DEI and woke, that's catching, and that people who would not necessarily take that view because it seems to be spreading around the community, around the country. It's part of that divisiveness, isn't it? And so what you have is this kind of viral attraction to racism by virtue of these catchphrases. Do you agree?
I do agree. I mean, it's rhetoric that's used to mobilize support. As I was saying earlier, I think that it has activated people's maybe underlying racial resentments, things that wouldn't necessarily be at the top of their mind, but now they're being told, priming and framing in politics is essential. There's all kinds of information that people are receiving every day. How should I interpret the fact that I didn't get the job I applied for? Or people in need are receiving benefits. Is that just because I wasn't qualified enough? Is that a good thing that we're supporting people in need? Or should I view this as some particular group of people are being given an advantage I didn't get? And people, political elites can very powerfully frame issues. This has been shown and again throughout the political science literature, right? I mean, how people interpret a political event is very dependent on the leaders that they look up to, how they're told or to think about an event through what frame. And with Donald Trump's rhetoric, that is, I think, for many of his supporters, becoming the dominant frame, that it is this racialized view of the world, that somehow they are disadvantaged, and other people are receiving unfair advantages. And so because that's top of mind, because so much of what Trump says activates, I think, a latent racism that, is often present for many Americans, many white Americans. But given other options, that's not necessarily the go-to. But I think frequently, because of Trump's rhetoric, it is becoming that.
Yeah, and it's not only rhetoric; it's policy. I mean, there's so many things are happening. We have this kind of this flood of lies, this flood of hatred, may I say, this flood of divisiveness coming out of him. And it comes out of him in terms of the daily expressions of policy, whether they're legitimate legal policies, like many of the executive orders are not, but he keeps doing that. And I wanted to ask you about some of the other issues that may also be a wolf in sheep's clothing. For example, I never understood why gun violence was such a problem for him. You realize that over the time of his first term and now, he has never taken a position against gun violence, and yet we have gun violence every day. Maybe the media doesn't cover it enough, but the fact is we still have it, and he does nothing about it. Is there some connection, do you think?
Well, I think for Trump and for many Republicans, I mean, this has been a voting issue for their base. So, but I mean, there's there's never been, I think, a political motivation for Trump to try to clamp down on gun violence. I mean, the interesting thing is, I mean, for Trump, I think this is all instrumental. I don't think he has himself strong opinions about gun ownership. I mean, he's not a hunter. He's from New York City. This is not a culture he's all that familiar with. But I think he learned pretty early on that people who own guns like Donald Trump and like his style. And so it's this is one view where Donald Trump tracks pretty closely to mainstream Republicans. I mean, that's for at least since the mid '90s. Opposing restrictions on gun ownership has been a pretty core principle of the Republican Party.
If you assume that racism ultimately turns into violence, guns are helpful, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I agree with you there. I mean, I think that this is a broader point. That as people become more fearful, as they're told and understand the world through these racialized lenses, I mean, the us versus the them, they feel the need to protect themselves. I mean, that this is a rational response. If you think the country is out of control, I mean, if there's chaos, and this is what Donald Trump tells us is going on, I mean, he always activates people's fears about immigrants or lawlessness or crime, even though there's not really any evidence that this is, crime in general has gone up. If you're told that, you're going to be afraid, and one way to protect yourself, of course, is to buy a gun. And the danger is that people who might tend to some kind of political violence now are armed.
Mm. On both sides of the equation. Yeah.
On both sides of the equation. I mean, I think that's interesting. One interesting thing is I think this has even affected liberals. I mean, I think that there is a fear among this fear has kind of been internalized among some Democrats who are worried for different reasons and maybe considering owning firearms now in ways they've never had in the past.
And then on my list to ask you about is religion. It's Christian nationalism, which is different than Christianity, and it's different than Christianity without the nationalism, and it's different from all the other religions in the country. And the unspoken word in the phrase Christian nationalism is white Christian nationalism.
Mhm.
So is this one of those badges of racism, of intolerance that we find where Trump, and the government, the Republican government in general, would like to favor one religion in violation of the First Amendment against all others, and inherently one race against all others? Your thoughts?
I think that's right. I mean, this Christian nationalism has often been motivated by this sense of resentment. I mean, you sometimes hear these bizarre pronouncements coming out of the White House. I mean, people told to report incidents of discrimination against Christians, something that virtually doesn't exist in this country. I can't think of a clear incident in the workplace or something like that where you would see evidence of Christian discrimination. But this is part of this ideology of grievance that Donald Trump has done so much to use to vault himself into power. I mean, there's a sense that among Christian nationalists that they are under attack, and they are the only ones standing up for the godly country of the United States. I mean, this isn't just like racism. I mean, this sense of white Christian nationalism is deeply embedded into American traditions. But I think Donald Trump has activated this in the most destructive ways. And it's interesting how, the new Pope himself has been critical of Trump and many other Christian leaders. But the white evangelical churches have often benefited from a sense that they are under attack, and this goes to their early activism in politics. I mean, churches weren't all that politicized until the 90s. I mean, as in terms of being reliable Republican voters. But this is something actually it's Karl Rove and a few other people realized that they could mobilize white Christian churches as reliable Republican voters, particularly on the issue of abortion. I mean, this again is not something that is, I think, a deeply held belief of Donald Trump. I mean, I don't think he has really any personal objections to abortion, but it has become appointing judges, for example, who conservative judges who wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade. I mean, that that I think has bought him the loyalty of evangelical churches forever, even though much of what he does doesn't seem particularly Christian. I mean, they invested in him and they got the thing they wanted most of all.
Yeah, before we get to the question of how this affects his power and his move to autocracy, I wanted to ask you about the kahuna in the room, which is migration and immigration. It seems to me that his initiative here is against Latinos. It's against anybody south of the border. You don't find him doing that against people north of the border, or particularly from Europe, but only Latin America and Africa. And I wonder what that means. I mean, every day we get examples of how he would divide immigrants and migrants, including many of whom have a good right to stay in this country, how he would make mistakes and send them back and refuse to correct his mistakes. I mean, this has to be playing to something, but it sounds like it's playing to racism.
I think it is. I mean, interestingly, I mean, this is an area where it depends on how you ask the question, how supportive Americans are of what Trump is doing on immigration. I mean, I think that if you want to talk about reducing border crossings, they're in favor of it, but there's been a surprising opposition. I mean, in terms of public opinion surveys about deporting people without due process, what has happened in El Salvador, that may have taken Trump a little bit off guard. I think that is not playing as well as he thought. But the political framing of immigration under Trump, I mean, this has been a core part of his belief. I mean, from inflammatory rhetoric, right, calling Mexican immigrants racist, I mean, rapists and criminals, like he did in the launch of his campaign. It goes to this crisis narrative, right, that the southern border is chaotic and dangerous, and he will save us all. And of course, it emphasizes this us versus them populism, right? I mean, that the elites betrayed you, and they're weak, and as a result, you're losing your national sovereignty. I think there's even there's a darker version of this also, which is the kind of replacement hypothesis that somehow elites were attracting immigrants to replace the core white Americans, and that has activated deep fear among people who feel that somehow their country is being stolen from them. So Trump has used these in very clever ways to make people more fearful, to paint immigration as a crisis, and of course to claim that something has to be done now, right now, or you'll lose your country forever.
At Charlottesville, there were chants by some of the right-wing extremists to the effect that Jews will not replace us. The replacement theory that you mentioned. And to tell you the truth, right now, Trump seems to be supporting Netanyahu and Israel. And because the Christian nationalists are interested in the religious aspects of Israel, they support him and he supports them. But query, this is a hard one, Colin. We know he's flexible. We know, for example, that the pause on the tariffs isn't going to stay. He'll find a way out of that. He'll find an off-ramp. And I wonder your thoughts about anti-Semitism, because there is a lot of undercurrent anti-Semitism in this country, just like there is racism against blacks. And I wonder your thoughts about maybe Trump could change his mind, son-in-law or not, Netanyahu or not, and one day decide he wants to take advantage of what's out there in terms of this, long strain of anti-Semitism in the country. Your thoughts?
I think it's possible. I mean, I don't think that there's anything Trump wouldn't do to stay in power or do because he thought it would be in his political advantage. I think right now he sees his support for Israel as politically to his benefit. He famously moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, but he's never really disavowed extremism. So he plays this very strange game when it comes to anti-Semitism, where I mean the rhetoric coming out from the administration, one of their more powerful rhetorical points in attacking universities is that places like Columbia and Harvard and others has this deeply embedded anti-Semitic ideology. And they've been harshly critical, of course, of students protesting in support of Palestine. But at the same time, he hasn't really disavowed organizations or groups that are very clearly anti-Semitic. I mean, like you mentioned, Charlottesville and saying very fine people on both sides. I mean, that, as I mentioned earlier, that shocked even members of his cabinet. I mean, he's been very cozy with the kind of QAnon conspiracy theories that, for QAnon, right? I mean, it is riddled with these anti-Semitic conspiracies that, somehow the government is full. I mean, there's the old, the classics of these anti-Semitic, Jewish globalist conspiracies that go back for 200 years. He hasn't really disavowed those. So he seems perfectly comfortable hanging out with or accepting support from people who are clear anti-Semites. At the same time, when it's convenient, he presents himself as the person who is defending American Jews, defending Israel. So he's very flexible. And I think that the groups who feel like they can use him to achieve what they want in Israel are playing with fire.
Yes. Oh, yes. Well put. So I wanted to get to the question of power. It seems to me that all of this is just one element of his quest for power, and maybe a very important one. Does this give him this intolerance and the encouragement of intolerance give him a benefit in terms of his obviously seeking power and trying to create a dictatorship, maybe a lifelong dictatorship, and fascism, in American type fascism? What sort of role does all of this play in his efforts to do that?
Well, I mean, it keeps his followers are deeply loyal. I mean, and it separates the loyalty from some kind of policy outcomes. I mean, but that's why Donald Trump probably has a floor in his support of 30 to 35% of Americans. There's almost nothing he can do where those folks would decide they're going to go their separate ways with Donald Trump, because it's a core part of their identity. It doesn't really have much of anything to do with the policies he supports. I mean, the loyalty to Donald Trump is primarily about people's sense of grievance, and their sense that only an authoritarian leader like Trump can save us all from this the invasion of the barbarians. I mean, that is the rhetoric I think many of these people believe. There's other things that go along with this that are also very, very dangerous. I mean, to present himself as an authoritarian leader, I mean, the need for an authoritarian leader, his argument always is that I have to be here because these other institutions, the courts, the media, the bureaucracy, they're corrupt or they're run by enemies. And so when people believe that these core institutions are corrupt or rigged, that is shifting their loyalty from a system, the constitutional system, to an individual, Donald Trump. That's very powerful for Trump because there's nothing he can do that would, I think, shift their loyalty away. And you've seen the results of this, right? I mean, Donald Trump is nothing if not a survivor. He's survived impeachments, indictments, defeat. I think many people are still shocked that he managed to come back and win re-election. I think after um, January 5th, people thought he was done. I mean, that had gone too far, that Americans wouldn't tolerate that. Well, it turns out they will, and because his political identity is, he set himself up as a symbol of resistance. It's not even about being a Republican. I mean, Donald Trump, I don't think cares very much about the Republican Party at all. I mean, and certainly core Republican political principles he's basically overturned. I mean, who knew that the Republican Party was going to become the party of tariffs? I mean, they were during the McKinley administration, but they haven't been the party of tariffs since at least the 80s. And Donald Trump turned that all around because he is this symbol of resistance. I mean, it is about only, as he frequently has said in one of his more rhetorically powerful lines, only I can save you. Let me be your hammer. Let me be your voice. This is the language of authoritarian leaders throughout history.
I think we agree that he's exacerbated the intolerance in our country, the racial hatred, and the policy that expresses the racial hatred. And it has gotten worse, even in only a few short weeks, and it will get worse as we go down the line. But the question is, in the past, for other societies, other periods of history, it's hard to get rid of this. It's hard to get rid of divisiveness, especially when it's on a roll the way it is now. Um, how do you get rid of this? How do you turn the country around, say to the 60s, to the civil rights movement, to caring for your neighbor and the country? Um, it sounds like a very difficult task. Is there a way within the structure, what remains of the American government, to return to a better time, to return to a time of greater tolerance, to return to a time where citizens care about the welfare of each other?
There is, but I think it's going to be very hard. I mean, it's much easier to tear this down than to build it up. I mean, I think the first step is our leaders that model restraint and reconciliation. I mean, that don't exploit these differences, but repudiate extremism. That avoid this kind of incendiary rhetoric. I mean, this is an example. I mean, maybe the most famous example of this is Nelson Mandela, who, in a way that is still um, amazing to reflect upon, took post-apartheid South Africa, one of the most divided and racist societies in the world. Um, and it certainly has had its share of problems since Mandela. But he did manage to forge this shared identity of the South African nation in a way no one thought possible. And partly it was because he avoided the kind of easy, cheap um, demagoguing that that might have been effective and popular in the short term. I mean, the other thing, and some of this is what partially gives me hope, is also cross-cutting identities and encounters. I mean, this is a very diverse country. I mean, you mentioned Hawaii earlier, but the entire country has become dramatically more diverse over the last 40 years. And so it is very difficult for people to even if they wanted to hold themselves up and try to exist only with talking to people from their ideological background, from their racial background. And as a result of that, you get to know people who are different. And it's much harder to demonize people you know. I mean, you may not like a certain group, but Joe, your colleague, and you enjoy his company. And he happens to be a member of that, uh, group that you were theoretically supposed to hate. That's where things begin to break down, and that's what gives me some hope.
Well, on a personal level, what should people be thinking and doing to deal with this? And I mean, a lot of people are either being turned toward greater intolerance or perhaps turned away from it. What is your advice to people who are either going one direction or the other? What should they be thinking about?
Well, I think that there's no silver bullet. Obviously, I mean, the first thing I'd say is to defend democratic norms. I mean, I think you have to um, reject the kind of false equivalencies, call out authoritarian behavior. You have to demonstrate institutional respect. I mean, I think model healthy civic and political disagreement. Engage with people who disagree with you, um, and don't assume that because someone disagrees with you, they're corrupt or they're motivated by some sinister um, goal. I mean, they simply have a different view. So I think we need to get better at having those conversations. It's become too easy to cons- consume media or talk to people about politics who agree with you. And liberals are as guilty of this as conservatives. And so part of this is making an effort to model um, that kind of civic dialogue, and that starts in strengthening local civic institutions. I mean, I think that we are so intensely focused on national politics in this country. But for most people, where you can really make a difference is in local politics. I mean, that's where you actually have power. And local politics doesn't tend to be polarized in the same way. You know, local politics, the issues are much more concrete. They're not existential. They are about building a rail, or whether or not we should slightly raise hotel taxes. These are not the sort of things that people tend to get in fistfights over. And so I think that's healthy too. You can invest in being active on local civic issues, and that I think that's a good outlet, and I think it's often a place where people can make a difference, and it's not a part of our politics that has quite been as poisoned as national politics.
Who was it, um, the politician who said all politics are local?
That's right. Tip O'Neill,
Tip O'Neill.
Speaker Tip O'Neill.
Great wisdom in that. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much to our guest, Colin Moore, director of the UH Public Policy Center. I'm Jay Fidell, host of American Issues Take One, and we've been discussing the weaponization of intolerance in the US. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Colin.
Aloha. Thanks, Jay. Good to see you.
The same here.